Love is but a prelude to life, an overture in which the theme of the impending work is exquisitely hinted at, but which remains nevertheless only a symbol and a promise. What is to follow, if all goes well, begins presently to appear. Passion settles down into possession, courtship into partnership, pleasure into habit. A child, half mystery and half plaything, comes to show us what we have done and to make its consequences perpetual. We see that by indulging our inclinations, we have woven about us a net from which we cannot escape. Our choices, bearing fruit, begin to manifest our destiny. That life which once seemed to spread out infinitely before us is narrowed to one mortal career. We learn that in morals the infinite is a chimera, and that in accomplishing anything definite a man renounces everything else. He sails henceforth for one point of the compass. The family is one of nature's masterpieces. It would be hard to conceive a system of instincts more nicely adjusted, where the constituents should represent or support one another better. The husband has an interest in protecting the wife, she in serving the husband. The weaker gains in authority and safety, the wilder and more unconcerned finds a helpmate at home to take thought for his daily necessities. Parents lend children their experience and a vicarious memory. Children endow their parents with a vicarious immortality. The long childhood in the human race has made it possible and needful to transmit acquired experience. Possible because the child's brain, being immature, allows instincts and habits to be formed after birth, under the influence of that very environment in which they are to operate. And also needful, since children are long incapable of providing for themselves and compel their parents, if the race is not to die out, to continue their care and to diversify it. To be born half made is an immense advantage. Structure preformed is formed blindly, but a priori is as dangerous in life as in philosophy. Only the cruel workings of compulsion and extermination keep what is spontaneous in any creature harmonious with the world it is called upon to live in. Nothing but casual variations could permanently improve such a creature, and casual variations will seldom improve it. But if experience can cooperate in forming instincts, and if human nature can be partly a work of art, mastery can be carried quickly to much greater lengths. This is the secret of man's preeminence. His liquid brain is unfit for years to control action advantageously. He has an age of play which is his apprenticeship, and he is formed unawares by a series of selective experiments, of curious gropings, while he is still under tutelage and suffers little by his mistakes. Had all intelligence been developed in the womb, as it might have been, nothing essential could have been learned afterward. Mankind would have contained nothing but doctrinaires, and the arts would have stood still forever. Capacity to learn comes with dependence on education, and as that animal which at birth is most incapable and immature is the most teachable, so too those human races which are most precocious are most incorrigible, and while they seem the cleverest at first, prove ultimately the least intelligent. They depend less on circumstances, but do not respond to them so well. In some nations, everybody is by nature so astute, versatile, and sympathetic that education hardly makes any difference in manners or mind, and it is there precisely that generation follows generation without essential progress, and no one ever remakes himself on a better plan. It is perhaps the duller races, with a long childhood and a brooding mind, that bear the hopes of the world within them, if only nature avails to execute what she has planned on so great a scale. Generation answers no actual demand except that existing in the parents, and it establishes a new demand without guaranteeing its satisfaction. Birth is a benefit only problematically and by anticipation, on the presumption that the faculties newly embodied are to be exercised successfully. The second function of the family, to rear, is therefore higher than the first. To foster and perfect a life after it has been awakened, to cooperate with a will already launched into the world, is a positive good work. It has a moral quality and is not mere vegetation. For in expressing the agent and giving him ideal employment, it helps the creature affected to employ itself better, and to find expression. In propagating and sowing broadcast precarious beings there is fertility only, such as plants and animals may have. But there is charity in furthering what is already rooted in existence and is striving to live. This principle is strikingly illustrated in religion. When the Jews had become spiritual, they gave the name of Father to Jehovah, who had before been only the Lord of armies or the architect of the cosmos. A mere source of being would not deserve to be called Father unless it shared its creature's nature and therefore their interests. A deity, not so much responsible for men's existence or situation as solicitous for their welfare, who pitied a weakness he could not have intended and was pleased by a love he could not command, might appropriately be called a father. It then becomes possible to conceive moral intercourse and mutual loyalty between God and man, such as Hebrew religion so earnestly insisted on. For both then have the same interests in the world and look toward the same consummations. So the natural relations subsisting between parents and children become moral when it is not merely derivation that unites them, but community of purpose. The father then represents his children while they are under his tutelage, and afterward they represent him, carrying on his arts and inheriting his mind. These arts in some cases are little more than retarded instincts, faculties that ripen late and that manifest themselves without special instruction when the system is mature. So a bird feeds her young until they are fledged and can provide for themselves. Parental functions in such cases are limited to nursing the extremely young. This phase of the instinct, being the most primitive and fundamental, is most to be relied upon even in man. Especially in the mother, care for the children's physical well-being is unfailing to the end. She understands the vegetative soul, and the first lispings of sense and sentiment in the child have an absorbing interest for her. In that region, her skill and delights are miracles of nature, but her insight and keenness gradually fade as the children grow older. Seldom is the private and ideal life of a young son or daughter a matter in which the mother shows particular tact, or for which she has instinctive respect. Even rarer is any genuine community in life and feeling between parents and their adult children. Often the parent's influence comes to be felt as a dead constraint, the more cruel that it cannot be thrown off without unkindness. And what makes the parent's claim at once unjust and pathetic is that it is founded on passionate love for remembered being, the child once wholly theirs that no longer exists in the man. To train character and mind would seem to be a father's natural office, but as a matter of fact, he commonly delegates that task to society. The fledgling venturing for the first time into the air may learn of his father and imitate his style of flight. But once launched into the open, it will find the whole sky full of possible masters. The one ultimately chosen will not necessarily be the nearest. In reason, it should be the most congenial, from whom most can be learned. To choose an imitable hero is the boy's first act of freedom. His heart grows by finding its elective affinities, and it grows most away from home. It will grow also by returning there, when home has become a part of the world or a refuge from it. But even then, the profoundest messages will come from religion and from solitary dreams. The consequence is that parental influence, to be permanent, requires that the family should be hedged about with high barriers and that the father be endowed with political and religious authority. He can then exercise the immense influence due to all tradition which he represents and all law which he administers. But it is not his bare instincts as a father that give him this ascendancy. It is the social system that has delegated to him most of its functions, so that all authority flows through him, and he retails justice and knowledge, besides holding all wealth in his hand. When the father, apart from these official prerogatives, is eager and able to mold his children's minds, a new relation, half natural and half ideal, which is friendship, springs up between father and son. In this, ties of blood merely furnish the opportunity, and what chiefly counts as a moral impulse, on the one side, to beget children in the spirit, and on the other, a youthful hunger for experience and ideas. If Nunc Dimittis is a psalm for love to sing, it is even more appropriate for parental piety. On seeing heirs and representatives of ours already in the world, we are inclined to give them place and trust them to realize our foiled ambitions. They, we fancy, will be more fortunate than we. We shall have screened them from whatever has most maimed our own lives. Their purer souls, as we imagine, will reach better things than are now possible to ours. Distracted and abused so long, we commit the blotted manuscript of our lives more willingly to the flames, when we find the immortal text already half engrossed in a fairer copy. In all this there is undoubtedly a measure of illusion, since little clear improvement is ordinarily possible in the world. And while our children may improve upon us in some respects, the devil will catch them unprepared in another quarter. Yet the hope in question is a transcript of primary impersonal functions to which nature, at certain levels, limits the animal will. To keep life going was, in the beginning, the sole triumph of life. Even when nothing but reproduction was aimed at or attained, existence was made possible and ideally stable by securing so much. And when the ideal was enlarged so as to include training and rearing the new generation, life was even better entrenched and protected. Though further material progress may not be made easier by this development, since more dangers become fatal as beings grow complex and mutually dependent, a great step in moral progress has at any rate been taken. In itself, a desire to see a child grow and prosper is just as irrational as any other absolute desire. But since the child also desires his own happiness, the child's will sanctions and supports the father's. Thus, two irrationalities, when they conspire, make one rational life. The father's instinct and sense of duty are now vindicated experimentally in the child's progress, while the son, besides the joy of living, has the pious function of satisfying his parents' hopes. Even if life could achieve nothing more than this, it would have reached something profoundly natural and perfectly ideal. In patriarchal ages, men feel it is enough to have inherited their human patrimony, to have enjoyed it, and to hand it down unimpaired. He who is not childless goes down to his grave in peace. Reason may afterward come to larger vistas and more spiritual aims, but the principle of love and responsibility will not be altered. It will demand that wills be made harmonious and satisfactions compatible. Life is experimental, and whatever performs some necessary function and cannot be discarded is a safe nucleus for many a parasite, a starting point for many new experiments. So the family, in serving to keep the race alive, becomes a point of departure for many institutions. It assumes offices which might have been allotted to some other agency, had not the family preempted them, profiting by its established authority and annexing them to its domain. In no civilized community, for instance, has the union of man and wife been limited to its barely necessary period. It has continued after the family was reared and has remained lifelong. It has commonly involved a common dwelling and religion and often common friends and property. Again, the children's emancipation has been put off indefinitely. The Roman father had a perpetual jurisdiction and such absolute authority that, in the palmy days of the Roman family, no other subsisted over it. He alone was a citizen and responsible to the state, while his household were subject to him in law, as well as in property and religion. In simple rural communities, the family has often been also the chief industrial unit, almost all necessaries being produced under domestic economy. Now, the instincts and delights which nature associates with reproduction cannot stretch so far. Their magic fails, and the political and industrial family, which still thinks itself natural, is in truth casual and conventional. There is no real instinct to protect those who can already protect themselves, nor have they any profit in obeying, nor, in the end, any duty to do so. The patria potestas, much prolonged or extended, is therefore an abuse and prolific in abuses. The chieftain's mind, not being ruled by parental instincts, will pursue arbitrary personal ends, and it is hardly to be expected that his own wealth or power or ideal interests will correspond with those of his subjects. The government and supervision required by adults is what we call political. It should stretch over all families alike. To annex this political control to fatherhood is to confess that social instinct is singularly barren, and that the common mind is not plastic enough to devise new organs appropriate to the functions which a large society involves. After all, the family is an early expedient and in many ways irrational. If the race had developed a special sexless class to be nurses, pedagogues, and slaves, like the workers among ants and bees, and if lovers had never been tied together by a bond less ethereal than ideal passion, then the family would have been unnecessary. Such a division of labor would doubtless have involved evils of its own, but it would have obviated some drags and vexations proper to the family. For we pay a high price for our conquests in this quarter, and the sweets of home are balanced not only by its tender sorrows, but by 1,000 artificial prejudices, enmities, and restrictions. It takes patience to appreciate domestic bliss. Volatile spirits prefer unhappiness. Young men escape as soon as they can, at least in fancy, into the wide world. All prophets are homeless and all inspired artists. Philosophers think out some communism or other, and monks put it in practice. There is indeed no more irrational ground for living together than that we have sprung from the same loins. They say blood is thicker than water, yet similar forces easily compete while dissimilar forces may perhaps cooperate. It is the end that is sacred, not the beginning. A common origin unites reasonable creatures only if it involves common thoughts and purposes, and these may bind together individuals of the most remote races and ages when once they have discovered one another. It is difficulties of access, ignorance, and material confinement that shut in the heart to its narrow loyalties, and perhaps greater mobility, science, and the mingling of nations will one day reorganize the moral world. It was a pure spokesman of the Spirit who said that whosoever should do the will of his Father who was in heaven, the same was his brother and sister and mother. The family also perpetuates accidental social differences, exaggerating and making them hereditary. It thus defeats that just moiety of the democratic ideal which demands that all men should have equal opportunities. In human society, chance only decides what education a man shall receive, what wealth and influence he shall enjoy, even what religion and profession he shall adopt. People shudder at the system of castes which prevails in India. But is not every family a little caste? Was a man assigned to his family because he belonged to it in spirit, or can he choose another? Half the potentialities in the human race are thus stifled, half its incapacities fostered and made inveterate. The family, too, is largely responsible for the fierce prejudices that prevail about women, about religion, about seemly occupations, about war, death, and honor. In all these matters, men judge in a blind way, inspired by a feminine passion that has no mercy for anything that eludes the traditional household, not even for its members' souls. At the same time, there are insuperable difficulties in proposing any substitute for the family. In the first place, all society at present rests on this institution, so that we cannot easily discern which of our habits and sentiments are parcels of it, and which are attached to it adventitiously and have an independent basis. A reformer hewing so near to the tree's root never knows how much he may be felling. Possibly his own ideal would lose its secret support if what it condemns had wholly disappeared. For instance, it is conceivable that a communist, abolishing the family in order to make opportunities equal and remove the more cruel injustices of fortune, might be drying up that milk of human kindness which had fed his own enthusiasm. For if the foundlings which he decreed were to people the earth, they might at once disown all socialism and prove a brood of inhuman egoists. Or, as not wholly contemptible theories have maintained, it might happen that if fathers were relieved of care for their children, and children of all parental suasion, human virtue would lose its two chief stays. On the other hand, an opposite danger is present in this sort of speculation. Things now associated with the family may not depend upon it, but might flourish equally well in a different soil. The family being the earliest and closest society into which men enter, it assumes the primary functions which all society can exercise. Possibly, if any other institution had been first in the field, it might have had a comparable moral influence. One of the great lessons, for example, which society has to teach its members is that society exists. The child, like the animal, is a colossal egoist, not from a want of sensibility, but through his deep transcendental isolation. The mind is naturally its own world, and its Solipsism needs to be broken down by social influence. The child must learn to sympathize intelligently, to be considerate, rather than instinctively to love and hate. His imagination must become cognitive and dramatically just, instead of remaining, as it naturally is, sensitively, selfishly fanciful. To break down transcendental conceit is a function usually confined to the family, yet the family is not well fitted to perform it. To mothers and nurses, their darlings are always exceptional. Even fathers and brothers teach a child that he is very different from other creatures and of infinitely greater consequence, since he lies closer to their hearts and may expect from them all sorts of favoring services. The whole household, in proportion as it spreads about the child a brooding and indulgent atmosphere, nurses willfulness and illusion. For this reason, the noblest and happiest children are those brought up, as in Greece or England, under simple general conventions by persons trained and hired for the purpose. The best training in character is found in very large families or in schools, where boys educate one another. Priceless in this regard is athletic exercise, for here the test of ability is visible, the comparison not odious, the need of cooperation clear, and the consciousness of power genuine and therefore ennobling. Socratic dialect is not a better means of learning to know oneself. Such self-knowledge is objective and free from self-consciousness. It sees the self in a general medium and measures it by a general law. Even the tenderer associations of home might, under other circumstances, attach to other objects. Consensus of opinion has a distorting effect, sometimes on ideal values, a thing which almost everyone agrees in prizing, because it has played some part in every life, tends to be valued above more important elements in personal happiness that may not have been shared. So wealth, religion, military victory have more rhetorical than efficacious worth. The family might well be, to some extent, a similar idol of the tribe. Everyone has had a father and a mother, but how many have had a friend? Everyone likes to remember many a joy and even sorrow of his youth, which was linked with family occasions, but to name a man's more private memories, attached to special surroundings, would awaken no response in other minds. Yet these other surroundings may have been no less stimulating to emotion, and if familiar to all might be spoken of with as much conventional effect. This appears so soon as any experience is diffused enough to enable a tradition to arise, so that the sentiment involved can find a social echo. Thus there is a loyalty, very powerful in certain quarters, toward school, college, club, regiment, church, and country. Who shall say that such associations, had they sprung up earlier and been more zealously cultivated, or were they now reinforced by more general sympathy, would not breed all the tenderness and infuse all the moral force which most men now derive from the family? Nevertheless, no suggested substitute for the family is in the least satisfactory. Plato's is the best grounded in reason, but to succeed it would have to count on a degree of virtue absolutely unprecedented in man. To be sure, the Platonic regimen, if it demands heroism for its inception, provides in its scientific breeding and education a means of making heroism perpetual. But to submit to such reforming regulations, men would first have to be reformed. It would not suffice, as Plato suggested, merely to enslave them and to introduce scientific institutions by despotic decrees. For in such a case there would be all manner of evasions, rebellions, and corruptions. If marriage founded on inclination and mutual consent is so often broken surreptitiously or by open divorce, what should we expect amongst persons united and separated by governmental policy? The love of home is a human instinct. Princes who marry for political reasons often find a second household necessary to their happiness. Although every motive of honor, policy, religion, and patriotism makes with overwhelming force against such irregularities, and the celibate priesthood, presumably taking its vows freely and under the influence of religious zeal, often revert in practice to a sort of natural marriage. It is true that Plato's citizens were not to be celibates, and the senses would have had no just cause for rebellion. But would the heart have been satisfied? Could passion or habit submit to such regulation? Even when every concession is made to the godlike simplicity and ardor which that Platonic race was to show, a greater difficulty appears. Apparently the guardians and auxiliaries, a small minority in the state, were alone to submit to this regimen. The rest of the people, slaves, tradesmen, and foreigners, were to live after their own devices and were, we may suppose, to retain the family. So that after all, Plato in this matter proposes little more than what military and monastic orders have actually done among Christians. To institute a privileged unmarried class in the midst of an ordinary community. Such a proposal, therefore, does not abolish the family. Those forms of free love or facile divorce to which radical opinion and practice incline in these days tend to transform the family without abolishing it. Many unions might continue to be lasting, and the children in any case would remain with one or the other parent. The family has already suffered greater transformations than that suggested by this sect. Polygamy persists, involving its own type of morals and sentiment, and savage tribes show even more startling conventions. Nor is it reasonable to dismiss all ideals but the Christian and then invoke Christian patience to help us endure the consequent evils, which are thus declared to be normal. No evil is normal. Of course, virtue is the cure for every abuse, but the question is the true complexion of virtue and the regimen needful to produce it. Christianity, with its non-political and remedial prescriptions in the form of prayer, penance, and patience, has left the causes of every evil untouched. It has so truly come to call the sinner to repentance that its occupation will be gone if once the sin could be abolished. While a desirable form of society entirely without the family is hard to conceive, yet the general tendency in historic times, and the marked tendency in periods of ripe development, has been toward individualism. Individualism is in one sense the only possible ideal, for whatever social order may be most valuable can be valuable only for its effect on conscious individuals. Man is of course a social animal and needs society first that he may come safely into being, and then that he may have something interesting to do. But society itself is no animal and has neither instincts, interests, nor ideals. To talk of such things is either to speak metaphorically or to think mythically. And myths, the more currency they acquire, pass the more easily into superstitions. It would be a gross and pedantic superstition to venerate any form of society in itself, apart from the safety, breadth, or sweetness which it lent to individual happiness. If the individual may be justly subordinated to the state, not merely for the sake of a future, freer generation, but permanently and in the ideal society, the reason is simply that such subordination is a part of man's natural devotion to things rational and impersonal, in the presence of which alone he can be personally happy. Society, in its future and its past, is a natural object of interest like art or science. It exists like them because only when lost in such rational objects can a free soul be active and immortal. But all these ideals are terms in some actual life, not alien ends, important to nobody, to which notwithstanding everybody is to be sacrificed. Individualism is therefore the only ideal possible. The excellence of societies is measured by what they provide for their members. A cumbrous and sanctified social order manifests dullness and cannot subsist without it. It immerses man in instrumentalities, weighs him down with atrophied organs, and by subjecting him eternally to fruitless sacrifices renders him stupid and superstitious and ready to be himself tyrannical when the opportunity occurs. A sure sign of having escaped barbarism is therefore to feel keenly the pragmatic values belonging to all institutions, to look deep into the human sanctions of things. Greece was on this ground more civilized than Rome, and Athens more than Sparta. Ill-governed communities may be more intelligent than well-governed ones, when people feel the motive and partial advantage underlying the abuses they tolerate, as happens where slavery or nepotism is prevalent. But when, on the other hand, no reason is perceived for the good laws which are established, as when law is based on revelation, the effort to adjust old institutions suddenly to felt needs may not always be prudent, because the needs most felt may not be the deepest. Yet so far as it goes, the effort is intelligent. The family in a barbarous age remains sacrosanct and traditional. Nothing in its law, manners, or ritual is open to amendment. The unhappiness which may consequently overtake individuals is hushed up or positively blamed, with no thought of tinkering with the holy institutions which are its cause. Civilized men think more and cannot endure objectless tyrannies. It is inevitable, therefore, that as barbarism recedes, the family should become more sensitive to its members' personal interests. Husband and wife, when they are happily matched, are in liberal communities more truly united than before, because such closer friendship expresses their personal inclination. Children are still cared for, because love of them is natural, but they are ruled less and sooner suffered to choose their own associations. They are more largely given in charge to persons not belonging to the family, especially fitted to supply their education. The whole, in a word, exists more and more for the sake of the parts, and the closeness, duration, and scope of family ties comes to vary greatly in different households. Barbaric custom, imposed in all cases alike without respect of persons, yields to a regimen that dares to be elastic and will take pains to be just. How far these liberties should extend and where they would pass into license and undermine rational life is another question. The pressure of circumstances is what ordinarily forces governments to be absolute. Political liberty is a sign of moral and economic independence. The family may safely weaken its legal and customary authority so long as the individual can support and satisfy himself. Children evidently never can. Consequently, they must remain in a family or in some artificial substitute for it, which would be no less coercive. But to what extent men and women in a future age may need to rely on ties of consanguinity or marriage in order not to grow solitary, purposeless, and depraved is for prophets only to predict. If changes continue in the present direction, much that is now in bad odor may come to be accepted as normal. It might happen, for instance, as a consequence of women's independence, that mothers alone should be their children's guardians and sole mistresses in their houses. The husband, if he were acknowledged at all, having at most a pecuniary responsibility for his offspring. Such an arrangement would make a stable home for the children while leaving marriage dissoluble at the will of either party. It may well be doubted, however, whether women, if given every encouragement to establish and protect themselves, would not in the end fly again into man's arms and prefer to be drudges and mistresses at home to living disciplined and submerged in some larger community. Indeed, the effect of women's emancipation might well prove to be the opposite of what was intended. Really free and equal competition between men and women might reduce the weaker sex to such graceless inferiority that, deprived of the deference and favor they now enjoy, they should find themselves entirely without influence. In that case, they would have to begin again at the bottom and appeal to arts of seduction and to men's fondness in order to regain their lost social position. There is a certain order in progress which it is impossible to retract. An advance must not subvert its own bases, nor revoke the interest which it furthers. While hunger subsists, the art of plowing is rational. Had agriculture abolished appetite, it would have destroyed its own rationality. Similarly, no state of society is to be regarded as ideal in which those bodily functions are supposed to be suspended, which created the ideal by suggesting their own perfect exercise. If old age and death were abolished, reproduction indeed would become unnecessary. Its pleasures would cease to charm the mind, and its results, pregnancy, childbirth, infancy, would seem positively horrible. But so long as reproduction is necessary, the ideal of life must include it. Otherwise, we should be constructing not an ideal of life, but some dream of non-human happiness. A dream whose only remnant of ideality would be borrowed from such actual human functions as it still expressed indirectly. The true ideal must speak for all necessary and compatible functions. Man being an inevitably reproductive animal, his reproductive function must be included in his perfect life. Now, any function to reach perfection must fulfill two conditions. It must be delightful in itself, endowing its occasions and results with ideal interest, and it must also cooperate harmoniously with all other functions so that life may be profitable and happy. In the matter of reproduction, nature has already fulfilled the first of these conditions in its essentials. It has indeed superabundantly fulfilled them. Not only has love appeared in man's soul, the type and symbol of all vile perfection, but a tenderness and charm, a pathos passing into the frankest joy, has been spread over pregnancy, birth, and childhood. If many pangs and tears still prove how tentative and violent, even here, are nature's most brilliant feats, science and kindness may strive not unsuccessfully to diminish or abolish those profound traces of evil. But reproduction will not be perfectly organized until the second condition is fulfilled as well, and here nature has as yet been more remiss. Family life, as Western nations possess it, is still regulated in a very bungling, painful, and unstable manner. Hence, in the first rank of evils, prostitution, adultery, divorce, improvident and unhappy marriages, and in the second rank, morality compacted of three inharmonious parts, with incompatible ideals, each in its way legitimate. I mean the ideals of passion, of convention, and of reason. Add besides genius and religion thwarted by family ties, single lives empty, wedded lives constrained, a shallow gallantry, and a dull virtue. How to surround the natural sanctities of wedlock with wise custom and law, how to combine the maximum of spiritual freedom with the maximum of moral cohesion, is a problem for experiment to solve. It cannot be solved, even ideally, in a utopia. For each interest in play has its rights, and the prophet neither knows what interest may be, and the prophet neither knows what interest may at a given future time subsist in the world, nor what relative force they may have, nor what mechanical conditions may control their expression. The statesman in his sphere and the individual in his must find, as they go, the best practical solutions. All that can be indicated before is the principle which improvements in this institution would comply with if they were really improvements. They would reform and perfect the function of reproduction without discarding it. They would maintain the family unless they could devise some institution that combined intrinsic and representative values better than does the natural artifice. And they would recast either the instincts or the laws concerned, or both simultaneously, until the family ceased to clash seriously with any of these three things: natural affection, rational nurture, and moral freedom.